I stood across the street from the Grand Lotus Hotel, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I watched the first of the luxury cars pull up to the entrance. A woman in an emerald green cheap Pao emerged, my former mother-in-law, Chen Meiling. Even from this distance, I could see the satisfaction radiating from her face. Behind her came her husband, her two daughters, her son, my ex-fiancé, Lin Jianyu. My phone buzzed. Another call from my mother. I declined it just as I declined the previous 47 calls this morning. The wedding was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. The hall I'd rented and paid for in full, despite their protests that the groom's family should handle it, would be decorated exactly as Lin Jianyu's mother had demanded. White roses, not the pale pink peonies I'd wanted. A Western-style ceremony, not the traditional Chinese one I'd dreamed of since childhood. Even the menu had been chosen by her, overriding every preference I'd expressed. But there was one critical difference between this wedding and the one from my previous life. This time, I wasn't going to show up. I watched as more guests arrived, my aunt and uncle who'd spent years telling me how lucky I was that the Lin family had agreed to this marriage despite my difficult personality. My father's business partners, who'd convinced him that this union would save our family company from bankruptcy. My own father, who'd chosen his company over his daughter without a second thought. And finally, my mother and younger sister, Xinyi. My sister wore a dress almost as elaborate as a bride's, her face glowing with barely suppressed excitement. In my first life, I'd been too naive to understand why. My phone rang again. This time it was John Yu. I answered, "Where are you?" His voice was sharp, annoyed. Not worried. Never worried. "Everyone's waiting. You're embarrassing me." Am I? I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. That's funny. I was thinking about the last time I was embarrassed. What are you talking about? Stop being dramatic and get here, now. I'm thinking about 3 years from now, I said softly. About a hotel room. Room 2408 specifically. The Ritz-Carlton downtown. Do you remember it, John Yu? Or should I say, do you remember planning it? The silence on the other end was delicious. Because I do, I continued. I remember the wedding that never happened. I remember waiting for 3 hours in that hall while your mother told everyone you were just running late. I remember the pitying looks, the whispered conversations, the way my own mother told me to stop crying and go apologize to your family for whatever I'd done to upset you. And I remember finding out, 6 months later, that you'd spent our wedding day in that hotel room with my sister. You're insane, he hissed, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. How could you possibly? The thing about dying and being given a second chance, I interrupted, is that you remember everything, every single thing, including the way your family and mine conspired to steal my grandmother's inheritance after I died of grief-induced heart failure. Funny how grief can be induced when someone slowly poisons your food for 6 months, isn't it? I hung up and turned off my phone. Behind me, a black Mercedes pulled up. The window rolled down, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who in my first life had died 2 years before my disastrous wedding. In this life, I'd made sure she got the medical attention she needed before that aneurysm could kill her. Ready to go? She asked. I slid into the car, and we drove away as the first sounds of chaos began to erupt from the hotel behind us. In my first life, I was 23 years old when I married into the Lin family, or rather, when I was supposed to marry into the Lin family. I'd always been the difficult daughter. That's what my mother told me repeatedly my entire life. My sister Xinyi was 2 years younger, beautiful, charming, and everything I wasn't. Where she excelled at playing the piano, I preferred books. Where she knew how to smile and flatter, I asked uncomfortable questions. Where she understood how to make herself useful to our family's social climbing, I wanted to study art history and work in a museum. You're so selfish, my mother would say whenever I expressed any preference that didn't align with the family's plans. Do you know how much we've sacrificed for you? And this is how you repay us? The sacrifices she referred to were basic necessities: food, shelter, education. The same things she provided Xinyi without ever demanding repayment. But I was the eldest daughter, and I was supposed to understand that love was conditional. My father barely noticed me unless I'd done something wrong. He'd wanted a son, and after my mother gave him two daughters and the doctors told her she couldn't have more children, he'd grown distant and cold. His software company was his real child, his legacy, the thing he actually cared about. When I was 21, everything changed. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Linwei, fell seriously ill. Before she went into what everyone thought would be her final surgery, she pulled me aside. "I'm giving you everything," she whispered, her grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "Your mother doesn't know. The house, the investments, the jewelry collection, it's all in your name. I know you're the only one who won't waste it." She'd survived the surgery in my first life, but died 2 years later from a stroke. By then, she'd made sure all her assets were legally transferred to me. 6 million yuan in investments, a house in the historic district worth another 4 million, and a jewelry collection valued at over 2 million yuan. I'd been overwhelmed and terrified of the responsibility. My mother had been furious. "How dare she?" my mother had screamed when the lawyers informed us. "I'm her daughter. That money should have come to me." That's when the Lin family had entered our lives. Chen Mei-ling, a former school friend of my mother's, had mentioned that her son John Yu was looking to settle down. He was 28, handsome, worked in finance, and came from a good family, meaning they had money and connections. "He's willing to overlook your difficult personality," my mother had said, as if she were offering me a gift. "The Lins are a prestigious family. You should be grateful they're even considering you." I should have seen the red flags immediately. The way Chen Mei-ling's eyes had gleamed when my mother mentioned grandmother's inheritance. The way John Yu, on our first meeting, had asked more questions about my assets than about me as a person. The way my own parents pushed the relationship forward with unusual urgency. But I'd been lonely and desperate to be loved. When John Yu smiled at me and said I was refreshingly different from other girls, I'd believed him. When he said he wanted a wife who was smart and independent, I'd thought I'd finally found someone who valued me for who I was. The engagement happened within 3 months. The wedding was planned for 6 months after that. That's when things began to change. "My mother thinks we should have the wedding at the Grand Lotus Hotel," John Yu said one evening. We were supposed to be planning together, but he'd brought a list of decisions already made. "And she's already chosen the color scheme. White roses, very classic." I was thinking pale pink peonies, I'd said hesitantly. They were my grandmother's favorite. "My mother's already ordered the white roses. It would be rude to change it now." "But shouldn't we decide together?" "Why are you being so difficult?" he'd snapped. "This is exactly what my mother warned me about. You always have to make everything complicated." I'd backed down. I always backed down. Then came the prenuptial agreement. "It's just a formality," my father had said, pushing the papers across his desk toward me. "It protects both families." I'd read through it, my hands shaking. According to the terms, my inheritance from grandmother would be placed in a joint account with John Yu immediately upon marriage. If the marriage ended for any reason, the assets would be split 70-30, with 70% going to him as compensation for emotional damage and time invested. "This isn't fair," I'd whispered. "These are my grandmother's assets. She left them to me specifically." "Fair?" my mother had laughed. "Life isn't fair, darling. This is how marriage works. You combine your assets. The Lins are being incredibly generous by even allowing you to keep 30%. "But if we divorce, then you'll have driven away the only man who is willing to marry you," my mother said coldly. Sign it." My father had said nothing, just stared at me with those cold, disappointed eyes, until I picked up the pen. I'd signed. The months leading up to the wedding were a steady erosion of my boundaries and self-respect. Chen Mei-ling visited our house constantly, and my mother treated her like royalty while treating me like an inconvenient servant. They'd sit in our living room planning our wedding, while I was expected to serve tea and nod along with their decisions. "The bride's family pays for the wedding, of course," Chen Mei-ling had announced. "It's tradition. And since dear Lin Wei left you so much, money shouldn't be an issue." 300,000 yuan for a wedding I didn't want, in a style I didn't choose, to marry a man who grew colder to me every day. But I'd convinced myself it was normal, that this was what love looked like in a practical adult relationship. That once we were married, things would get better. The day before the wedding in my first life, I'd discovered the truth by accident. I'd gone to John Yu's apartment to drop off some final paperwork. He was supposed to be at his bachelor party, but I'd needed him to sign a form for the hotel. I'd used the key he'd given me, for emergencies only, and let myself in. I'd heard the giggling first, then the unmistakable sounds of two people who weren't being careful about the noise they made. I'd stood frozen in his living room, listening to my sister's laughter coming from his bedroom. "Tomorrow's going to be perfect," Xinyi had said breathlessly. "Your mother's already spread the story that she's been having second thoughts, that she's emotionally unstable. No one will be surprised when you don't show up." "It was easier than I thought," John Yu had replied. "She signed the prenup without even fighting. Once we're legally married and the inheritance is in the joint account, we'll wait a few months, then get the divorce. By then, the money will be mixed with marital assets that I've already prepared. She'll be lucky to get 10% by the time my lawyers are done. And then we can be together?" "Then we can be together. Your mother's already agreed to accept our relationship once your sister's out of the picture. She knows you're the better daughter anyway." I'd stumbled backward, out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. I'd walked for hours, my mind blank with shock. I should have called off the wedding. I should have exposed them. I should have protected myself. Instead, I'd done what I'd been conditioned to do my entire life. I'd tried to fix myself. I'd convinced myself I'd misheard or misunderstood. I'd told myself that John Yu would come to the wedding, and we'd work through whatever problems we had in our marriage. I'd arrived at the Grand Lotus Hotel 3 hours before the ceremony, in my dress, with my hair and makeup done. I'd waited in the bridal suite while the guests arrived, while the ceremony time came and went, while Chen Meiling made increasingly elaborate excuses about traffic and last-minute business, emergencies. I'd waited for 6 hours before my mother had finally come to the bridal suite. "He's not coming," she'd said flatly. "Apparently you've been smothering him with your demands and unrealistic expectations. The Lin family is extremely hurt by your behavior, and John Yu has decided he needs time to reconsider the marriage." "But I didn't." "Don't lie to me. Chen Meiling told me everything. The way you've been trying to control every aspect of the wedding, the way you've been spending money recklessly, the way you've been emotionally manipulating John Yu." None of it was true. But in that moment, watching my mother look at me with such disgust, I'd realized the truth. It didn't matter what was true. It only mattered what served their purposes. The prenuptial agreement had a clause I'd missed. If the wedding didn't take place, but the bride-to-be had spent marital assets in preparation, those expenditures could be claimed as debt. The 300,000 yuan I'd spent on the wedding, from my grandmother's inheritance, was suddenly marital asset spending that I owed to John Yu. "You'll need to transfer the money to cover the debt," my father had told me 2 days later. "It's only right. You did spend the money on a wedding that didn't happen because of your behavior." "But I spent it on our wedding. The contract is clear. Pay it, or the Lins will sue. And believe me, you don't want to go against their lawyers." I'd paid. 300,000 yuan, gone. The cooling-off period lasted 3 months. During that time, Chen Meiling and my mother had worked together to isolate me from anyone who might support me. My few friends were told I'd had a mental breakdown and needed space. My grandmother's old friends were informed that I was too unstable to visit. And then, suddenly, John Yu had come back. "I'm willing to give you another chance," he'd announced as if he were the injured party. "But there will be conditions." The conditions: I would transfer my remaining inheritance into a joint account to show my commitment to the marriage. We would live with his parents until I learned to be a proper wife. I would quit my job at the museum because a wife shouldn't prioritize career over family. I'd agreed to all of it because by then, I'd been so broken, so convinced of my own worthlessness that I'd believed I was lucky he was willing to marry me at all. The second wedding was small, quiet, and completely on the Lin family's terms. No celebration, no joy, just a signing of papers and a ceremony with only immediate family present. My grandmother's inheritance was transferred that same day. The marriage lasted 6 months. 6 months of living in Chen Meiling's house, being criticized for every breath I took. 6 months of watching John Yu spend my inheritance on luxury cars and expensive watches while telling me I was too materialistic when I asked for money for basic necessities. 6 months of being slowly poisoned by Chen Meiling's special soups that made me increasingly weak and confused. And through it all, my sister visited regularly. She and John Yu weren't even subtle anymore. They'd disappear together for hours while I was resting from my mysterious illness. I died on a Tuesday in the hospital with no one holding my hand. The doctors called it heart failure brought on by malnutrition and stress. I was 24 years old. I'd floated above my body, watching my mother and sister sort through my few remaining possessions while discussing where they'd go for dinner. "At least it's over," my mother had said. "Now Chen Meiling won't have any reason to look too closely at how the rest of the inheritance was handled. And John Yu and I can finally be together openly," Xin Yi had added. That's when I'd understood. They'd planned it all from the beginning. My mother had conspired with Chen Meiling to steal my inheritance. Xin Yi and John Yu had been involved from the start. My father had enabled all of it in exchange for business connections with the Lin family. They'd murdered me, and they'd gotten away with it. Then I'd woken up. I'd been 18 years old again, lying in my childhood bed, with 5 years of memories from a life not yet lived. The first thing I'd done in my second life was cry. The second thing I'd done was start planning. I had 5 years to prepare before the Lin family entered our lives, 5 years to build defenses, gather evidence, and most importantly, save my grandmother's life. At 18, I'd still been 2 years away from grandmother's first health crisis, but I'd remembered every detail the doctors had told us. An undiagnosed aneurysm, weakness in her blood vessels that could have been caught and treated if anyone had been paying attention. I'd convinced her to get a full health screening by telling her I'd had a nightmare about losing her. She'd laughed and indulged me, and the doctors had found the aneurysm. Surgery, recovery, and careful monitoring had kept her alive and healthy. With grandmother alive and alert, I'd had an ally. I'd told her everything about the future I'd seen, about the family's betrayal, about my death. Most people would have thought I was insane, but grandmother had always been sharp. "I believe you," she'd said simply after I'd finished talking. "Your mother has always been jealous of you, did you know that? You're smarter than her, more creative, more independent. She spent your entire life trying to break that spirit." "What should I do?" "First, we protect my assets. I'll transfer everything to you now, but through a trust that your mother and father can't touch or even know about. Second, you focus on building your own life and career. And third, when the Lin family comes calling, you let them think they're winning, right until you pull the rug out from under them." Over the next 3 years, I'd followed her advice. I'd gone to university, for art history as planned, but I'd also taken business and law courses. I'd interned at museums, built a network of contacts, and quietly begun authenticating and selling pieces from grandmother's jewelry collection to build my own independent wealth. I'd also documented everything. Every criticism from my mother, every time my father chose Xin Yi over me, every moment of favoritism and cruelty. I'd kept records, recordings, and detailed notes. Not because I'd known exactly how I'd use them, but because grandmother had taught me, information is power, and they've underestimated you long enough. When I turned 21, grandmother had transferred her assets to my trust as planned. My mother's fury had been just as intense as I'd remembered. And right on schedule, Chen Meiling had reappeared in my mother's life, mentioning her son, John Yu. This time, I'd known exactly what was happening. But instead of refusing outright, which would have made them suspicious and might have led them to find other ways to get to my inheritance, I'd decided to play along. "I'll meet him," I'd told my mother, watching her surprise. "If he's as wonderful as you say, I'd be happy to get to know him." I'd met John Yu at the same upscale restaurant as before. He was just as handsome, just as charming, and just as transparent once you knew what to look for. Every question designed to assess my wealth, every compliment calibrated to make me feel special while keeping me insecure enough to be manipulated. I'd played the role of the lonely, desperate daughter perfectly. I'd accepted his compliments, agreed to his suggestions, and let him think he was in complete control. The engagement happened on schedule, the wedding planning began, and just like before, Chen Meiling and my mother had taken over every detail, making increasingly outrageous demands that I'd appeared to meekly accept. But this time, there were differences they didn't notice. I'd insisted on keeping my job at the museum. framing it as wanting to be a worthy wife who contributes to the family. They'd allowed it because they'd assumed I'd quit once we were married anyway. I'd hired my own lawyer, a family friend of my grandmother's, to review the prenuptial agreement, then signed it anyway after he'd made some subtle changes to the wording that transformed it from a tool of theft into a potential liability for them. I'd paid for the wedding as expected, but not from my inheritance. I'd used money from selling several pieces of grandmother's collection, pieces I'd secretly had appraised as fakes decades ago, then replaced with even better fakes. The real pieces were safely stored in a bank vault, along with documentation proving they'd always belonged to grandmother and therefore to me alone. And I'd watched Xin Yi and John Yu, letting them think they were being subtle when they flirted at family dinners, when they disappeared together during parties, when they exchanged loaded glances they thought I was too naive to notice. The day before the wedding, the same day I'd caught them together in my first life, I'd sent Xin Yi a text. Can you help me with something at John Yu's apartment? I need to drop off some papers, but I'm running late. She'd agreed eagerly, probably thinking it was an opportunity to spend time alone with him. I'd waited exactly 15 minutes after she arrived, then sent a group text to my parents, John Yu's parents, and several key family friends. I'm so sorry, but I need to pick up the contract from John Yu's apartment. Can someone meet me there in 20 minutes? I'm not sure I understand some of the clauses. I'd timed it perfectly. I'd arrived at the apartment building just as my entire audience was pulling up, looking annoyed at the inconvenience. I'm so sorry, I'd said, looking flustered and apologetic. I probably should have called earlier. Let me just run up and... I'll go with you, Chen Meiling had said impatiently. We can review the contract together. My mother had joined us, not wanting to be left out. My father had followed. John Yu's father, Chen Guowei, had come along. We'd taken the elevator up. I'd used my key to unlock the apartment door, and we'd all walked in together to find John Yu and Xin Yi in his bed, too engrossed in each other to hear us enter. The screaming had been spectacular. Xin Yi had tried to claim I'd set her up, that she'd come over to talk to John Yu about my strange behavior, and he'd taken advantage of her. John Yu had tried to claim that I'd been neglecting him and driving him into another woman's arms. But I'd been ready. I'd pulled out my phone and played the recordings I'd made, using the same security app I'd installed on my laptop in preparation, from earlier conversations between Xin Yi and John Yu. Conversations where they'd discussed their plan in explicit detail. Conversations that proved premeditation and conspiracy. You see, I'd said softly as everyone had stood in shocked silence. I know because I've lived through this before. I died in a future that now won't happen. Poisoned and betrayed by all of you, but I came back, and this time, I'm not playing the victim. My mother had tried to salvage the situation. This is just a misunderstanding. We can work through... No, I'd said firmly. The wedding is off, the engagement is ended, and as of this moment, you're all going to learn that stealing from me has consequences. I'd walked out of that apartment, leaving chaos behind me. But I hadn't called off the wedding, not publicly. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, I'd let everyone scramble. The Lin family had tried to contact me, offering apologies and excuses. My parents had demanded I stop being dramatic and work things out. Xin Yi had sent teary messages about how she'd made a mistake and never meant to hurt me. I'd responded to none of them. Instead, I'd done something far more satisfying. I'd prepared the trap. The wedding venue was still booked and paid for, the invitations had gone out, the date had remained unchanged, and everyone, the Lin family, my family, all the guests who'd been invited to witness my humiliation, had received confirmations that the wedding was still on. What they didn't know was that I'd also filed several legal documents in the past 2 weeks. A lawsuit against John Yu for fraud and breach of contract. A complaint against Chen Meiling for attempted theft and conspiracy. Reports to the tax authorities about suspicious business dealings I'd uncovered while reviewing documents at my father's company. Documents that revealed he'd been embezzling and hiding money with the Lin family's help. All of it was set to be filed and served the morning of the wedding, and I'd made sure I wouldn't be there to watch. The morning of the wedding, I'd woken up early in my grandmother's house, the beautiful historic property that was legally mine and had never been at risk in this timeline. I'd had breakfast on the terrace, watching the sunrise, feeling more at peace than I had in either of my lives. My phone had started ringing at 8 a.m., My mother, panicking because I wasn't at home preparing. I'd ignored her. At 9 a.m., Chen Mei-ling had called, then John Yu, then my father, all ignored. At 10 a.m., I'd gotten dressed, not in a wedding dress, but in an elegant black suit, and had grandmother drive me to the cafe across from the Grand Lotus Hotel. I'd wanted to see it, just for a moment. That's where I'd stood, drinking my coffee, watching them arrive. Watching the confusion start to build as it got closer and closer to the ceremony time, and I still hadn't appeared. Watching the moment John Yu had called me, and I'd told him I knew everything. The chaos that had followed had been beautiful. Chen Mei-ling had tried to hold everything together, making excuses, delaying the ceremony, sending people to look for me. My mother had been on the phone constantly, her voice getting more shrill with each passing minute. Guests had started whispering, pulling out their phones, checking social media. Because that's where I'd been busy that morning. I'd been posting a detailed account on every social media platform I had explaining what had happened. The betrayal, the conspiracy, the poisoning from my first life. I'd included evidence, recordings of Xin Yi and John Yu plotting, financial documents showing the attempted theft, even hospital records from my first life showing the suspicious circumstances of my death that had never been properly investigated. I'd tagged everyone, the families, the companies, the social circle that had been invited to my wedding. And I'd watched as the posts went viral, shared and reshared, commented on by thousands of people who'd been outraged by the story. By 11 a.m., the time the ceremony should have started, the hotel lobby had been in chaos. Reporters had started arriving, having seen the posts. The police had shown up to serve the legal documents I'd filed, and inside that beautiful decorated hall with its white roses and Western-style setup, 300 guests had sat in uncomfortable silence, realizing they'd been complicit in attempted fraud. That's when I'd gotten the most satisfying call of all. "You can't do this to us," my mother had shrieked. "Do you know what you've done? Your father's company is being investigated. The Lins are threatening to sue. Xin Yi's reputation is ruined, and all because you're too stubborn to forgive a little mistake?" "A little mistake," I'd repeated. "You conspired with the Lin family to steal my inheritance. You pushed me into a marriage designed to defraud me. In my first life, they poisoned me to death and you helped them cover it up. And you call that a little mistake? You're insane. None of that happened." It did happen. And it was going to happen again if I'd let it. But I didn't, Mother. I chose myself instead. "If you do this, you'll destroy this family." "Good," I'd said simply and hung up. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and public scandal. The investigation into my father's company had revealed years of financial fraud, committed in partnership with Chen Guowei. My father had been arrested for embezzlement and tax evasion. Chen Guowei had been charged as his accomplice. John Yu had faced fraud charges for the prenuptial agreement scheme, which my grandmother's lawyer had proven was designed specifically to defraud me of my inheritance. The recordings I'd made had been admissible as evidence, and combined with financial records showing a pattern of targeting wealthy young women, he'd been convicted. Chen Mei-ling had been charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, and after I'd provided evidence from my first life's medical records that I'd subpoenaed through careful legal maneuvering, attempted poisoning. The evidence had been circumstantial until they'd searched her home and found the same compounds that had been in my system before my death in my first life. My mother had faced social ruin. Every friend, every social contact, every connection she'd carefully cultivated over the years had turned their back on her once the full scope of what she'd done came to light. She'd been complicit in planning to defraud and potentially harm her own daughter for money. And Xin Yi, my darling sister who'd always been the favorite, had found herself completely isolated. The modeling contracts she'd been courting had evaporated. The wealthy men she'd been dating had disappeared. Her social media, once full of adoring comments, had become a wasteland of criticism and condemnation. But the most satisfying moment had come 3 months after the failed wedding. I'd been at my new job, a position as an assistant curator at a prestigious museum, earned through my own merit and connections built over years of hard work, when my assistant had told me there were visitors. My mother, father, and Xin Yi stood in the museum lobby looking diminished and desperate. "We need to talk," my father had said. He'd aged a decade in 3 months, his confidence completely shattered. "Please, just give us a few minutes." I'd considered refusing, but curiosity had won out. We'd sat in a quiet corner of the museum cafe. They'd looked at me like I was a stranger, like they were only now seeing me clearly for the first time. The lawyers said that if we could get you to drop the charges, they might be able to negotiate a better deal, my father had said. We're your family, my mother had added. Surely you don't want to see us completely destroyed. Family, I'd repeated softly. You know, in my first life, I died believing that family meant something, that despite everything, blood would matter in the end. But it didn't, did it? You sold me out for money and social status without a second thought. We made mistakes, Xinye had said, tears streaming down her face. But we can change, we can be better. Please just give us another chance. I gave you 23 years of chances, I'd replied. 23 years of accepting crumbs of affection and calling it love. 23 years of trying to be good enough, trying to be worthy of basic human decency from my own parents. And in the end, you murdered me for money. That didn't actually happen, my mother had protested. You said yourself it was a past life. It happened to me, I'd said firmly. By every moment of suffering, every betrayal, every instance of poison in my food, I lived through it. I died from it. And the only reason you didn't do it this time is because I stopped you. So that's it? My father had asked. You'll just let us rot in prison? Let your sister's life be ruined? Let your mother be shamed in every social circle? I'd stood up, preparing to leave. You taught me that family only matters when it's convenient, that love is conditional, that I'm only worth what I can provide. I'm simply applying the lessons you spent my entire childhood teaching me. Please, Xinyi had whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And for just a moment, I'd felt something close to pity. Because I'd realized that Xinyi had been groomed by our mother just as surely as I had been. She'd been taught that her value was in her beauty and her ability to manipulate men. She'd been turned into a weapon against me, and now she was being discarded because she'd failed. But pity wasn't the same as forgiveness. I'm not dropping the charges, I'd said. What happens to you now is the consequence of your own choices. I'm not responsible for saving you from yourselves anymore. I'd walked away, and I hadn't looked back. 6 months after the failed wedding, I'd been promoted to associate curator. A year after, I'd been given my own exhibition to organize. My grandmother's jewelry collection, properly authenticated and restored, had become the centerpiece of a major show on historical Chinese craftsmanship. I'd watched from the sidelines as my first life's timeline completely diverged from this one. Without the Lin family's money and connections, my father's company had collapsed entirely. He'd been sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud. Chen Guowei had received a similar sentence. Chen Meiling's attempted poisoning charges had been harder to prove, but the investigation had uncovered enough irregularities that she'd been convicted of fraud and conspiracy, receiving a 3-year sentence. John Yu had been sentenced to 4 years for his role in the prenuptial agreement scheme. More satisfyingly, the investigation had revealed that I hadn't been his first victim. 2 other women had come forward with similar stories of targeted romance and financial manipulation. His reputation was permanently destroyed. My mother had avoided prison, barely, but she'd lost everything else. My father's conviction meant she'd been left with nothing. No house, no savings, no social standing. She'd been forced to move in with a distant cousin in another province, where no one knew her shame. Xinyi had tried to rebuild her life but found every door closed. She'd eventually moved abroad, sending occasional messages that I left unread. I felt no satisfaction in her suffering, but I felt no guilt either. She'd made her choices, just as I'd made mine. My grandmother had watched it all with quiet satisfaction. You know, she'd said one evening as we'd shared dinner on her terrace, our terrace now, legally speaking, though I'd always think of it as hers. In my generation, we were taught to endure, to accept whatever our families chose for us, to put everyone else's needs before our own. That's what they tried to teach me too, I'd replied. But you didn't learn that lesson, did you? Even before you died and came back, you had that spark of rebellion in you, that refusal to accept that your worth was determined by other people's judgment. I almost lost it, though. In my first life, I let them break me. But you didn't stay broken, you came back fighting. She'd reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, granddaughter. Not because you destroyed your enemies, but because you saved yourself. 2 years after the failed wedding, I'd met someone new. His name was Wei Chen, and he was a visiting scholar at the museum, specializing in Song Dynasty art. We'd met while I was curating an exhibition on ancient pottery, and he'd offered insights that had completely transformed my understanding of one particular piece. I think you're wrong about the dating, he'd said bluntly, studying the pottery fragment I'd been examining. The glaze composition suggests it's at least 50 years earlier than currently attributed. I should have been offended. Instead, I'd been delighted to meet someone who cared more about historical accuracy than about flattering me. We'd started as colleagues, then friends, then something more. He'd asked me out after 3 months of working together, and I'd said yes with none of the desperate eagerness I'd felt with John Yu. This time, I'd known my worth. I'd known I didn't need him to complete me or validate my existence. My family's a disaster, I'd warned him early on. My parents are essentially in exile. My sister lives abroad in shame, and my grandmother is the only blood relative I speak to. My family's boring, he'd replied. They're academics who care more about ancient texts than modern drama. Want to trade? I'd laughed, and then more seriously. I died once. Well, I lived a whole life where people I trusted betrayed and killed me. And then I woke up as my 18-year-old self with all those memories intact. I know how it sounds, but it's true, and if you can't accept that part of my history, I believe you, he'd said simply. I've watched you work. I've seen the way you anticipate problems before they happen, the way you protect yourself without seeming paranoid. You move through the world like someone who knows exactly how dangerous it can be. And that doesn't scare you? Why would it? You survived something impossible and came out stronger. That's not scary, that's extraordinary. We'd been together for a year now, taking it slow, building something real. His family had welcomed me with genuine warmth. His mother had told me I was the smartest woman her son had ever dated. His father had engaged me in passionate debates about museum curation philosophy. It was such a stark contrast to the Lin family that sometimes I'd had to excuse myself to process the difference. This was what family could be, I'd realized. Supportive, respectful, genuinely interested in who I was, rather than what I could provide. Wei Chen had proposed 6 months ago, and I'd said yes, but this time we were doing everything differently. A small ceremony with only people who genuinely loved us. No prenuptial agreement because we were both financially independent and neither of us was trying to steal from the other. A partnership between equals rather than a transaction. The wedding was scheduled for next month. My grandmother would walk me down the aisle. Wei Chen's parents would be there, beaming with pride. My museum colleagues would attend, people who respected and valued me for my work and character, and somewhere far away, the people who'd once controlled my life would not be invited, would not be informed, would have no part in my happiness. The night before my actual wedding, the one I was choosing, the one I wanted, I'd sat with my grandmother in her garden, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. Do you ever regret it? She'd asked. The way you handled things with your family? You could have been merciful. You could have let some of it go. I'd considered the question carefully. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh. If I should have given them more chances, been more forgiving. But then I remember dying. I remember the taste of poison in Chen Meiling's soup. I remember the way my mother looked at my corpse like I was just an inconvenience she'd finally resolved. I remember Xinyi trying on my clothes before my body was even cold. I'd paused. They weren't sorry I was dead. They were relieved. So, no, I don't regret protecting myself from them. Good, grandmother had said firmly. There's a difference between forgiveness and allowing yourself to be victimized again. You chose survival and dignity. Never apologize for that. I just wish I could have saved them somehow. Xinyi especially. She was so young when mother started poisoning her mind. You can't save people from themselves. You gave Xinyi every opportunity to be better. She chose to side with your mother instead. That's on her, not you. I know, it's just, in this life, I had the power to change everything. But I couldn't change them. They still chose cruelty even when it wasn't necessary. Because cruelty was who they were, not just what they did to survive. You gave them a chance at a different path, and they tried to walk the same road anyway. Grandmother had squeezed my hand. Tomorrow, you start your new life with Wei Chen. You deserve every bit of happiness coming your way. The wedding was everything I'd wanted and nothing I'd been denied in my first life. Pale pink peonies everywhere, just like grandmother had loved. A traditional Chinese ceremony honoring our heritage. A small reception with food I'd chosen, music I loved, people who genuinely cared about me. Wei Chen had cried when he saw me in my qipao, a deep red silk embroidered with phoenixes, completely different from the white Western-style dress the Lin family had chosen for me. "You're stunning," he'd whispered, and I'm the luckiest man alive. "We're both lucky," I'd replied. "We found each other when we were whole people, not broken halves looking for completion." The ceremony had been beautiful. My grandmother's eyes had shone with tears as she'd placed my hand in Wei Chen's. His parents had welcomed me formally into their family, speaking words of genuine acceptance and love. And when it was over, when we'd danced and celebrated and laughed until our faces hurt, I'd stepped outside for a moment of quiet. I'd pulled out my phone and looked at the messages I'd been ignoring all day. My mother, begging to be invited. Jin Yi, pleading for a chance to apologize in person. Even John Yu, newly released from prison, sending a message about unfinished business. I'd deleted them all without responding. Then I'd opened my photo album and looked at a picture I'd kept from my first life, one of the few items that had somehow transferred with my memories when I'd been reborn. A photo of me on what should have been my wedding day, sitting alone in that bridal suite, my makeup streaked with tears. I'd looked at that girl, that version, of me who'd suffered and died and made a silent promise. I'd lived the life she'd deserved. I'd fought the battles she'd never gotten to fight. I'd chosen happiness and dignity and self-worth. "Thank you," I'd whispered to my past self. "Thank you for coming back and giving me the strength to do this differently." Then I deleted the photo and walked back inside to my husband, my future, and the life I'd earned through rebirth and revolution. 5 years after the non-wedding at the Grand Lotus Hotel, I'd achieved everything I'd dreamed of and more. I was the chief curator at one of Asia's most prestigious museums, with my own office, my own budget, and complete creative control over major exhibitions. My work had been featured in international publications. I'd written a book on Song Dynasty pottery that had become a standard reference text. Wei Chen and I had built a beautiful life together. We'd bought a house near grandmother's, close enough to visit easily, far enough to have our own space. We'd traveled to dozens of countries, exploring museums and historical sites. We'd talked about children someday, when we were ready. My grandmother had just celebrated her 75th birthday in perfect health, surrounded by friends and the family she'd chosen. Me, Wei Chen, his parents, and several of her old friends who'd always respected and loved her. And my revenge? It had been complete. My father had been released from prison after serving 3 years, his health broken and his spirit crushed. He'd sent one letter asking if we could meet. I'd sent back a single line. "You had a daughter once. You chose money over her. Live with that choice." Chen Guowei had been released around the same time. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he and my father had had a falling out, each blaming the other for their downfall. They'd both ended up working menial jobs, their reputations destroyed, their connections severed. Chen Meiling had served her full sentence and been released to find her family fractured beyond repair. Her husband blamed her for destroying the family. Her daughters had cut contact. And John Yu, her golden son, had become a bitter shell of a man who spent his time on incel forums blaming women for his own failures. John Yu himself had tried to rebuild his life after prison, but found that his crimes followed him everywhere. No reputable company would hire him. No woman would date him once they learned his history. He'd tried to start a men's rights blog that had gone nowhere. He'd sent me occasional messages threatening lawsuits for defamation. Lawsuits that never materialized because everything I'd said about him was true and documented. My mother had aged rapidly in exile, her beauty fading without the money to maintain it, her spirit broken by the loss of everything she'd valued. She'd sent periodic messages that I'd occasionally read but never answered. The last one had said simply, I see now that I destroyed the only thing of real value I ever had, my daughter. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand what I'd lost. I'd felt a twinge of something reading that, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the faintest beginning of peace with the past. She'd never be part of my life again, but maybe she'd finally learned something from the devastation she'd caused. Shinyi had sent a long letter on the 5-year anniversary of the failed wedding. In it, she'd detailed her therapy, her growing understanding of how our mother had manipulated both of us, her genuine remorse for her actions. She hadn't asked for forgiveness or reconciliation. She'd simply said, "You deserved better than me as a sister. I hope your life is everything you wanted it to be. You earned it." I'd kept that letter. I'd even written back, a brief note acknowledging her words and wishing her well in her healing. We'd never be close. The betrayal had been too deep, the harm too severe. But perhaps we could both move forward separately. Each building lives from the wreckage of our family. On the 5th anniversary of the non-wedding, Wei Chen had surprised me with a trip back to the Grand Lotus Hotel. "Are you sure about this?" I'd asked as we'd pulled up to the entrance. "This place has terrible memories." "That's why we're making new ones," he'd said. "You took back your life here. You chose yourself. I want to celebrate that with you." We'd had dinner in the hotel restaurant, toasting to second chances and new beginnings. Afterward, he'd led me to the event hall, the same hall where 300 guests had once waited for a bride who never arrived. But this time, it was empty except for us and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. "May I have this dance?" Wei Chen had asked, offering his hand. We'd danced in that space where I'd once been meant to sacrifice my dignity and autonomy, where my family had planned to witness my submission to their will, where their schemes had instead fallen apart because I'd refused to play the victim again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been reborn?" Wei Chen had asked as we'd swayed together. "If you'd just lived one life without the foreknowledge?" "I think about it sometimes," I'd admitted. "I'd probably be dead. Or if not dead, completely broken. Living a half-life in service to people who never loved me." "I'm grateful you came back," he'd said. "Selfishly, because otherwise I'd never have met you. But also because the world is better with you in it, whole and strong and living on your own terms." You know what's funny? I'd rested my head on his shoulder. In my first life, I thought my wedding day was supposed to be about becoming someone's wife, about joining a new family, about fulfilling some destiny or role. And now? Now I know that my wedding day, our wedding day, was about me finally becoming fully myself. Not half of something else, but complete on my own, choosing to share my life with someone who respects that completeness. We'd danced until the quartet had finished playing, until the hotel staff had politely indicated they needed to close the hall. Then we'd walked out into the warm night air, hand in hand, partners in a life built on truth and choice and hard-won freedom. As we'd driven away, I'd looked back at the Grand Lotus Hotel one last time. 5 years ago, I'd stood across the street watching my enemies arrive at my non-wedding. I'd watched their confusion, their panic, their realization that I'd outplayed them. That moment had been satisfying, but this moment, leaving with my husband, secure in my career, at peace with my choices, was so much better. This was what victory really looked like, not the destruction of my enemies, though that had been necessary, but the construction of a life so full and rich that they'd become irrelevant. I'd won not by making them lose, but by refusing to play their game at all, and in the end, that had been the most perfect revenge of all.